I never intended to overhear it. I wasn't trying to listen in, but sometimes the truth has a way of finding you, whether you're ready for it or not. It was a Saturday night. We had people over, her friends, her family, the ones she always seemed at ease with in a way she never quite was with me. I was in the kitchen, clearing plates, half tuned in to the conversation spilling in from the living room. They were laughing. Not just any kind of laughter, the kind that feels exclusive, like you're standing on the outside of a joke you were never meant to be part of. And then I heard her voice. He can't please anyone. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, light, effortless, like it was some undeniable fact, a truth so obvious it didn't even need to be explained. The laughter that followed was loud, genuine, shared, because apparently they all agreed. I didn't even know what the conversation had been about before that. Maybe she was talking about something minor, how I picked up the wrong brand of coffee or failed to fix the bathroom sink last week. Or maybe it was something deeper, how the gifts I gave never quite hit the mark, how I wasn't romantic enough, how I never made her feel the way she wanted. It didn't matter. The message was clear. I gripped the edge of the sink, waiting for her to take it back, to laugh and say she was joking, to soften the sting somehow. But she didn't. She just kept talking, moving on to the next topic like her words hadn't just landed like a slap across my face. At first, I wasn't angry. What I felt deep, burning, was humiliation. The kind that starts in your chest and spreads outward, making you feel small, like you've been stripped bare in front of an audience that already saw you as less than you thought you were. And then, realization hit. This wasn't new. This wasn't the first time she had spoken about me like this. I started tracing it all back. Offhand remarks, sarcastic digs, the way she rolled her eyes when I spoke, the sighs when I didn't get things exactly right. It had been happening for a long time. I had just refused to fully see it. I wasn't her equal. I was her punchline. I stood there, letting the conversation carry on without me, the laughter now just background noise. The dishes were done, but I didn't move. My hands stayed planted against the counter, gripping harder than they needed to. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. For years, I had bent over backward to make her happy, to be enough. I convinced myself that if I just tried harder, she'd see me differently. If I just did more, she'd love me more. But that's not how it worked, was it? She didn't see the effort. She didn't notice the sacrifices. She saw a man who never measured up. A man she could mock openly, right in front of the people she cared about most, without a second thought. And that's when something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to stand in the middle of that room and demand an apology. I wasn't going to make a scene. That would have been me, the old me, the one who always tried to fix things, to smooth things over, to prove I was worth something. Instead, I made a choice. I was done trying to please her. The rest of the night, I sat through the conversations like a ghost in my own home. I nodded when I was supposed to, responded when necessary, but I wasn't really there. My mind was somewhere else, sifting through memories I had buried for years. Later, after the guests had left and the house had gone silent, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She fell asleep fast, as if nothing had happened, as if the night had been completely ordinary. But for me, nothing was the same. That one sentence, so casual, so effortless, had cracked open a door I had spent years avoiding. And behind that door were all the moments I had ignored, excused, convinced myself weren't as bad as they felt. But now there was no unseeing it. And I knew I couldn't keep pretending anymore. The memories started flooding back. I remembered birthdays where I went out of my way to plan surprises, only to be met with a sigh and a dismissive, "You really thought I'd like this?" I remembered the time I cooked for her, put effort into making something special, only for her to take a single bite, wrinkle her nose, and push the plate aside without a word. I remembered dressing up for one of our rare date nights, putting in extra effort, hoping she'd notice, only for her to glance at me and say, "That's what you're wearing?" One memory after another, all stitched together like a highlight reel of every moment I had been made to feel small in this marriage. And yet, through it all, I had kept trying. I thought back to the first time I overheard her talking about me to her friends. It hadn't been as blunt as what she said that night, but the message had been just as clear. I had brushed it off, told myself people vent sometimes, that it didn't mean she didn't love me. I had convinced myself of a lot of things over the years. I told myself her constant criticism was just her way of pushing me to be better, that the coldness in her voice wasn't intentional, that her dissatisfaction wasn't about me, it was about something she was struggling with. I had rewritten reality so many times just to make it tolerable. But sitting there, letting every moment I had ignored replay in my head, something inside me shifted. For so long, I had exhausted myself trying to make her happy. I had believed that if I just did more, if I became better, if I changed enough, she would finally see me the way I had always seen her. But that night, I finally understood. It had never been about what I was doing wrong. It had always been about the fact that nothing I did would ever be enough for her. The next morning, I woke up different. Not lighter, not free, just aware. Aware in a way I had never been before. For years, my life had revolved around keeping her happy. Every choice I made, every little action, every word I spoke, I measured it against how she might react. Would she be annoyed? Would she be disappointed? Would she roll her eyes or let out that exhausted sigh that made me feel like a failure? I had adjusted, adapted, anticipated. Living with her was like walking across uneven floors. I had gotten so used to stepping carefully that I forgot what it felt like to just walk. But now, I didn't feel like walking carefully anymore. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't sit her down and say, "I'm done trying to please you." There was no need. Instead, I did something much simpler. I stopped. I stopped chasing approval that was never coming. That morning, as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, she walked in. Normally, I would have asked if she wanted some. This time, I didn't. I just poured my own cup, sat down at the table, and took a sip. She hesitated, standing there for a second, waiting, expecting me to offer. When I didn't, she let out a small huff and made her own. It was nothing, just a tiny moment. But to me, it felt like the first crack in a dam. Later that day, she asked me to pick something up from the store. I had other plans, things I actually wanted to do for myself for once. In the past, I would have dropped everything, rushed to the store without a second thought, just to avoid the inevitable sigh, the disappointed shake of her head, the silent message that I was failing her yet again. But this time, I simply said, "I can't. I've got things to do." She blinked, like she hadn't heard me right. "You can't." "No, not today." She scoffed, muttered something under her breath, and walked away. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. That was the usual pattern. I'd say no, she'd react, and then guilt would creep in until I caved. But not this time. This time, I felt relief. For years, I had exhausted myself justifying my own boundaries, over-explaining my choices, making excuses for why I deserved to have a say in my own life. But why? She had never given me the benefit of the doubt. She had never tried to see my side. So why was I wasting so much energy trying to be understood by someone who had no interest in understanding me? So I stopped explaining. If I didn't want to do something, I simply didn't do it. If she made a sarcastic remark, I didn't take the bait. I didn't argue, didn't try to prove her wrong. I just let the words hang in the air until the weight of my silence made it clear I wasn't playing along. If she badmouthed me to her friends, I didn't sit there and absorb it like it was my job to take the hit. I wasn't trying to be cruel. This wasn't about revenge, and I had no interest in playing games. But I had spent years bending over backward for someone who had never once met me halfway. And I was done. First, she didn't even notice. She had grown so used to me accommodating her, adjusting my every move around her moods, her wants, her expectations, that the change didn't register right away. But then, small things started to add up. I stopped filling the silence whenever she sighed dramatically, waiting for me to ask, "What's wrong?" I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I stopped bending over backward to make her comfortable at my own expense. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just quietly withdrew from the game I had unknowingly been playing for years. And that's when she noticed. It started with little jabs. "You've been acting weird lately. Is something wrong with you? You're different." At first, I think she assumed it was just a phase, like maybe I was in a mood or sulking about something. Something she expected me to bring up, waiting for her to ask. But I wasn't waiting. I wasn't expecting anything from her anymore. And that bothered her. She started testing me, throwing out little barbs to see if I'd react. You never do anything right. You'd be lost without me. God, you're impossible. Before, I would have jumped to defend myself. I would have tried to convince her she was wrong, to prove I was good enough, that I was worth something. But I wasn't that person anymore. I just looked at her, let her words sit there, and moved on. Like they meant nothing. Because they didn't. Not anymore. The first time I did that, just met her eyes, said nothing, and walked away. I saw something flicker across her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was uncertainty. And that's when it hit me. She had always been in control, not by force, not through outright commands, but through expectations. She had shaped me over time, wearing me down like water against stone, molding me into someone who never questioned, never pushed back, never existed outside of what she needed me to be. But now, that version of me was gone, and she had no idea what to do with that. I could see her scrambling to regain control in the only way she knew how, picking fights over nothing, nitpicking things that didn't matter, throwing out little remarks designed to bait me into reacting. But I wasn't playing anymore, and that scared her, because for the first time I wasn't afraid to lose her. She tried everything. When her usual tactics stopped working, she shifted strategies. First, she doubled down. More sarcasm, more passive-aggressive digs, more attempts to test if I would crack. But I didn't. I stayed calm. I didn't give her the reaction she was used to, and that's when I saw the panic set in. It was in the way she lingered when I didn't immediately answer her. The way she hovered, watching me, waiting for me to care the way I used to. She wanted me to argue, to fight back, to prove I still needed her approval. But that man was gone. Then came the anger. One night, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through my phone, completely unbothered. She was pacing, sighing under her breath, and I could feel the tension thickening in the room. I knew what was coming before she even said it. You don't even care anymore, do you? I looked up at her. I could have said a lot of things. I could have denied it, tried to soothe her like I always had. I could have pretended just to keep the peace. But I didn't feel like pretending anymore. But I didn't. No, that's all I said. No argument. No explanation. Just the truth. And that was the moment everything snapped. She lost control, not in a violent way, but in a way that told me she had finally realized she had no control left. She threw out every accusation she could grasp. How I was cold. How I had changed. How I had become selfish, distant, unrecognizable. You're not the man I married. That one made me pause, because for the first time in a long time, I looked at her and agreed. No, I'm not. And I wasn't. I wasn't the man who spent his life tiptoeing around her moods, sacrificing my own happiness just to keep her satisfied. I wasn't the man who buried his own needs to avoid another argument. I wasn't the man who needed her approval to feel like I was enough. I wasn't her version of me anymore, and I think that scared her more than anything, because she finally understood. I wasn't afraid of losing her. But her? She was afraid of losing the man she had molded, the man she had controlled for so long. She didn't take it well. After that night, after I told her I wasn't the man she married, something between us officially broke. The illusion, the one I had clung to for years, was gone. At first, she tried to pretend like nothing had changed. She carried on as if things were normal, going through the motions, waiting for me to fall back in line. She made little comments, subtle jabs, quiet tests to see if I would react. But I didn't. And that's when the silence started. She stopped trying to provoke me. She stopped trying to talk to me at all. Our house, once filled with tension, was now filled with something else entirely. Distance. And I was okay with that. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly bracing myself for the next cutting remark, the next passive-aggressive sigh, the next reminder that I would never be good enough in her eyes. I wasn't failing anymore, because I wasn't playing her game. I had nothing left to prove. Then one evening, she finally said it. So what now? I looked at her from across the room. She stood there with her arms crossed, her expression guarded. This wasn't about dinner. It wasn't about the weekend or some trivial, everyday thing. This was bigger. She knew it, and so did I. I took a deep breath. I don't know, I admitted. But I know I'm not going back to how things were. She stared at me for a long moment, and in that silence, something flickered across her face. Regret, realization, maybe even fear, because now she understood. I was done. Not just with the fighting, not just with the exhausting cycle of proving, apologizing, and fixing. I was done being someone I wasn't just to hold together something that had never really been whole in the first place. I don't know what she expected me to say. Maybe she thought I'd ask if we could fix things. Maybe she thought I'd say I still wanted this marriage. But I didn't, because I didn't want this. Not like this. Not the way it had been. Not the way it would always be. And deep down, I think she didn't want it either. The truth was, we had been done long before I stopped trying. The only difference now, I finally knew it.